The village of St. Mary Mead had always been a place of gentle rhythms. Its cobblestone streets, lined with tidy hedgerows and quaint cottages, seemed to exist in a perpetual state of calm, broken only by the occasional clatter of a milk cart or the soft tolling of the church bells. Yet even in a village so serene, the lives of its inhabitants were threaded with quiet ambitions, minor jealousies, and the occasional misjudgment of character. These were things that Miss Jane Marple had observed, with unerring patience for decades. It was on one of those radiant, late spring afternoons that the disturbance occurred, a garden party at the stately home of the Wilkinsons. Lady Agatha Wilkinson, widow of a retired colonel, prided herself on hosting the most impeccable gatherings, and today, with the lilacs in full bloom and the wisteria draped luxuriously over the trellis, everything appeared set for perfection. The tables were laden with delicate porcelain teacups, silver trays of finger sandwiches and rose-scented scones. Guests wandered through the manicured lawns, exchanging pleasantries, and occasionally glancing at the shimmering pond, where koi fish lazily circled beneath the dappled sunlight. Miss Marple arrived quietly, as was her custom, and stationed herself on a wrought-iron bench beneath a blossoming cherry tree. She wore her usual neat dress, with a scarf pinned carefully at her throat, and carried a small notebook in her gloved hand, not for writing, of course, but merely as a prop that made her appear engaged in nothing more than idle observation. She noted the gentle sway of the guests' conversations, the small hints of rivalry and forced smiles, the way Mrs. Larkins, the head of the village ladies' committee, kept glancing at the clock, as though timing herself for an invisible competition. The first guests to arrive were the young Mr. David Carraway and his sister, Miss Lillian Carraway, who had recently returned from the city after completing their studies. They exchanged lively chatter with Lady Wilkinson, laughing at something entirely inaudible to anyone except themselves, their presence immediately drawing attention from the other villagers, who regarded them with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. Then there was Reverend Peabody, whose kind eyes belied the sharpness of his mind, and Mr. Harold Thorne, a local solicitor, whose reputation for discretion was almost as well known as his subtle flair for gossip. Yet even as Miss Marple watched, she sensed the underlying tensions that often accompanied the outwardly polite smiles of St. Mary Mead's inhabitants. There was a slight stiffness in Mrs. Larkins' posture when she offered tea to Lady Wilkinson, a hesitation that betrayed her awareness of being judged. And Miss Carraway, for all her youthful brightness, seemed unusually alert to the movements of the older women, as if measuring their reactions to her presence. Miss Marple smiled faintly. One could learn a great deal by simply noting such details. It was in this setting, amid the fragrant blooms and the cheerful clinking of teacups, that the first hint of disruption appeared. A sudden cry from the far end of the garden turned the heads of every guest. "Oh, someone's fallen!" Lady Wilkinson exclaimed, her hand flying to her mouth. A crowd formed instantly around the source of the commotion. The butler, Mr. Peters, had discovered young Thomas Larkins, Mrs. Larkins' nephew, lying sprawled at the edge of the rose bed, a pale hand pressed against his chest. The sight was shocking, though the garden's serene beauty rendered it almost surreal. Miss Marple rose gracefully from her bench and edged closer, her keen eyes taking in every detail. Thomas's face was ashen, his lips slightly parted, and there was a small smear of soil across his sleeve. The guests murmured in alarm, some rushing to fetch water, others exclaiming over the sudden misfortune. Yet amidst the clamour, Miss Marple's attention was drawn not to the obvious but to the subtle. The angle of Thomas's fall seemed unusual. He had landed awkwardly, as though someone had pushed him, or perhaps he had stumbled over an object, one small and easily overlooked. A sharp knock of urgency came from the kitchen, and the maid, young Emily Hargrove, appeared in the garden doorway, her face pale but composed. I saw him near the pergola," she stammered, glancing nervously at the assembly. "He was arguing with Mr. Thorne just before he fell." Her words, though softly spoken, carried a weight that instantly drew whispers from the gathered guests. Miss Marple noted Emily's trembling fingers, the quick flicker of her eyes as she darted toward the hedges. Something about the maid's demeanour seemed oddly deliberate, though Miss Marple could not yet place why. A simple misstep, perhaps, or a more calculated avoidance. Patience, she reminded herself. All would reveal itself in due time, as it always did. The doctor was summoned post-haste, and he knelt beside Thomas, examining him with professional efficiency. "He's unconscious, but I fear it may be more serious than a simple faint," he murmured. The guests recoiled, a collective shiver rippling through the garden. The delicate tranquility of the afternoon had been shattered, replaced by a tense, almost palpable unease. Lady Wilkinson, ever the hostess, struggled to regain composure. "Do call the police," she instructed, her voice trembling slightly. "We must ensure everything is handled properly." The mention of the authorities sent another ripple of anxiety through the assembly. For though St. Mary Mead was quaint, the villagers knew all too well that even minor disturbances could unearth old grievances and hidden resentments. Miss Marple, however, remained outwardly calm, her mind quietly piecing together the fragments of observation. The young maid's evasive glance, the unusual posture of the victim, the subtle tension among the guests, all of these threads, insignificant in isolation, hinted at a pattern. And though no one else seemed aware, Miss Marple's experience had taught her that such trifles often contained the keys to understanding the most confounding of events. As the doctor prepared to carry Thomas into the house, Miss Marple followed at a measured pace, her eyes scanning the garden with a practiced vigilance. She had a sense that the afternoon's tranquility was gone forever, and that beneath the polite laughter and fragrant blossoms lay secrets far darker than anyone yet imagined, and, as she well knew, it would be the smallest details, the most overlooked gestures, that would ultimately reveal the truth. By the time Thomas Larkins had been carried indoors, the garden party had dissolved into a murmur of anxious whispers. The once bright afternoon now seemed dimmer, as though the sunlight itself had recoiled at the sudden shock. Guests drifted into small clusters, discussing the incident in tones of hushed speculation, each eager to assert their own version of events. Mrs. Larkins, pale and trembling, clutched her handkerchief tightly. "It simply must have been an accident," she insisted to anyone who would listen. "He's so clumsy at times, tripping over nothing. It could happen to anyone." But her voice wavered, betraying a worry she could not disguise. Her eyes kept darting toward Emily Hargrove, the young maid, whose presence seemed both essential and somehow unsettling. "Accident?" "Indeed," muttered Mrs. Larkins's neighbour, Mrs. Pritchard, who had taken it upon herself to circulate theories among the other guests. "I saw him arguing with Mr. Thorne just moments before he fell. There's more to it than mere carelessness, mark my words." Her tone was sharp, tinged with an air of self-importance. Many in the village had grown accustomed to her insistence that she always knew more than others. Miss Marple, sitting quietly on the low garden wall, observed the flurry with a careful eye. She noted how Mrs. Pritchard's remarks caused immediate ripples. Lady Wilkinson's lips tightened. Mrs. Larkins's brow furrowed, and even the usually unflappable Reverend Peabody adjusted his spectacles in slight concern. Gossip, Miss Marple thought, was a curious thing. It could reveal truths, distort them or conceal them entirely, depending on the teller's motives. Across the lawn, young Miss Carroway spoke in an animated whisper to her brother. "It must have been the butler," she suggested, eyes wide. "I saw him near the rosebed just before Thomas fell. Perhaps he slipped or dropped something." David Carroway nodded earnestly, though his expression betrayed uncertainty. They were newcomers to St. Mary Mead, and yet, even in their inexperience, they grasped the thrill of speculation. Meanwhile, Mr. Harold Thorne, the solicitor, stood apart from the groups, his hands folded over his waistcoat. He appeared calm, almost too calm, as though the attention on him irritated his sense of propriety. He murmured to no one in particular, "It is all very unfortunate, but we must avoid hasty conclusions. One must not rush to judgment, particularly in matters where reputations are involved." The remark, meant to reassure, had the opposite effect, causing several villagers to cast furtive glances at him, curiosity mingling with suspicion, the yow. Maid Emily hovered near the edge of the garden, her hands wringing the hem of her apron. She avoided eye contact with Mrs. Larkins and glanced nervously toward Miss Marple, who had not yet spoken a word. Emily's movements were small, almost imperceptible, yet they suggested a tension that went deeper than mere fright. Miss Marple, who had seen such things countless times, made a quiet note of it. Young people, especially those new to their positions, often carried secrets they could not articulate. Soon the village constable arrived, a portly man with a ruddy face whose very presence seemed to increase the tension. He had been summoned, in haste, and he approached the gathering with a careful official air. "I understand there's been an accident," he began, his tone meant to calm but failing to do so. "I need statements from everyone present. We must ensure the matter is investigated thoroughly." At once, murmurs of opinion intensified. "I told you it wasn't an accident," Mrs. Pritchard hissed, nudging a neighbour. "It's obvious to anyone with eyes." Others, less certain, tried to recollect the sequence of events, speaking over one another in a cacophony of theory and conjecture. Miss Marple listened with patience, letting the villagers' words drift past her ears, while she silently catalogued their expressions, gestures, and inflections. Human nature, she knew, often betrayed itself in such moments, far more than any witness statement ever could. Reverend Peabody, attempting to restore a sense of calm, addressed the assembly. "We must remain composed. Hasty accusations will serve no one, and our focus must be on ensuring Thomas receives proper care." He glanced toward the house where a servant had appeared at the window to signal the doctor. Yet even as he spoke, his brow creased thoughtfully. Subtle clues were rarely confined to words alone. Meanwhile, Lady Wilkinson, regaining some of her composure, attempted to reassure her guests. "Please, everyone, remember that accidents can happen even in the most careful of circumstances. Let us not allow this unfortunate event to overshadow our hospitality." Her attempt at diplomacy, though well-meaning, did little to quell the anxious chatter. Every whispered suggestion seemed to multiply, until the garden was alive with speculation as varied and colourful as the blooms themselves. Miss Marple's gaze, however, remained focused. She had already begun forming impressions. The stiffness of Mrs. Larkin's gestures, the over-eagerness of Mrs. Pritchard's accusations, the nervous avoidance of Emily the maid, and the oddly composed demeanour of Mr. Thorne. Each small detail added to a tapestry of subtle signals, patterns only she could perceive. While the villagers debated loudly, she pieced together motives, contradictions, and hesitations. It was the way people acted, not what they said, that mattered most. And in St. Mary Mead, beneath the veneer of gentility and decorum, Miss Marple sensed an undercurrent of resentment and concealed truths waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. The afternoon had begun in laughter and flowers, but by its end a tension had settled over the village, a quiet, suffocating awareness that nothing would ever be quite the same. And in the midst of it all, Miss Marple, seated on her bench, allowed herself a small, knowing smile. The threads of this incident were tangled, yes, but they were never so tangled that human nature could not be understood, if one only paid close enough attention. She had observed, she had noted, and she had already begun the first steps of untangling a puzzle that would test the very heart of St. Mary Mead. The following morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to a subdued hush, as though the previous day's disturbance had left an invisible pall over the village. The sun shone brightly, and yet even the birds seemed cautious, their songs clipped and hesitant. News of Thomas Larkin's fall had travelled swiftly, carried on the wings of gossip that refused to be contained by polite discretion. Miss Marple, having spent the early hours quietly reviewing her observations from the garden, walked slowly along the village lanes, nodding to familiar faces. She exchanged pleasantries with the baker, who appeared unusually distracted, and with Mrs. Pritchard, who attempted a faint smile while secretly casting a wary glance in her direction. Everyone, it seemed, was eager to discuss the incident, but none could articulate the deeper truths hiding beneath the surface. Her first stop was the Wilkinson estate. Lady Agatha, though composed, bore the tension in her carefully arranged posture. "Jane, I am grateful you have come," she said, ushering Miss Marple into the drawing-room. "You have always had a way of understanding people, even when no one else can. I hardly know what to make of yesterday." Miss Marple smiled faintly, folding her hands. "It is rarely the obvious, Agatha," she replied gently. "Sometimes the smallest detail can reveal the greatest truths. And in a village like ours, people often say one thing while thinking another." She let her words hang in the air, leaving Lady Wilkinson to contemplate them in silence. The room was quiet except for the ticking of an ornate clock. Miss Marple observed the arrangement of furniture, the subtle impressions on the carpet, where chairs had been moved, and the faint scuff mark near the French doors that led to the garden. She made a discreet mental note. Nothing in St. Mary Mead escaped the scrutiny of those who knew the village well enough to notice the slightest irregularity. Lady Wilkinson led her toward the garden. "Thomas is resting in the west wing. The doctor says he is stable, but we must be cautious. Emily is tending to him." Miss Marple noted Emily Hargrove's expression as she moved about with quiet efficiency. There was a diligence in her work, yes, but also a certain tenseness in the set of her shoulders, small hesitations, slight pauses, and nervous glances. All these were telling. "Emily," Miss Marple said softly, "might I speak with you for a moment?" The maid's eyes widened slightly, but she nodded, following Miss Marple toward the rosebed where Thomas had fallen. "I wonder, dear," Miss Marple began, "if you could tell me about yesterday." "Everything you remember in your own words." Emily's voice was low and uncertain. I was in the kitchen, arranging the tea trays. I saw Thomas near the pergola. He was talking with Mr. Thorne, as I told the others. I didn't see what happened next. I only heard the cry and ran out." She wrung her apron nervously. "I didn't want to get involved. I didn't think it was my place." Miss Marple studied her intently, noting the slight tremor in her hands, the way her eyes flicked toward the hedges as if seeking to escape notice. "I understand," she said kindly. "Sometimes the smallest actions, the briefest movements, can be crucial. And yet, even small actions speak volumes if one knows how to read them." Emily blinked, uncertain whether Miss Marple was scolding or merely observing. Miss Marple's attention then shifted back to the garden. She walked slowly along the path where Thomas had fallen, her gaze lingering on the scuffed earth and the shadows beneath the trellis. There was no obvious obstruction, yet the angle of the fall seemed peculiar. Accidents were possible, of course, but the slightest push, a misstep guided by another hand, could produce exactly the same scene. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple visited several other villagers, ostensibly to offer her sympathy, but in reality to observe. Mr. Thorne, when asked casually about the incident, provided a polished, careful account. He was polite, precise, and measured in his words, yet there was a subtle stiffness in his tone, a slight insistence on propriety that hinted at something unspoken. Miss Marple noted it with quiet interest. Mrs. Larkins, still visibly shaken, spoke in halting bursts about her nephew's clumsiness, insisting that nothing malicious could have occurred. Yet her frequent glances at Emily betrayed a deeper anxiety. Was it worry for Thomas or a suspicion she could not name? Miss Marple filed this observation away as another thread in the intricate tapestry she was beginning to weave. Even the Reverend Peabody, whose calm demeanor usually masked any underlying unease, exhibited faint signs of perturbation when recounting the sequence of events. He fidgeted with his watch chain and hesitated over details that to the untrained eye might seem trivial. To Miss Marple, these hesitations were significant. Human nature was rarely consistent, she thought, and even the kindest hearts often concealed contradictions. By mid-afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her own quiet home, settling into her familiar armchair by the window. She reflected on the morning's observations, allowing patterns to emerge. Mrs. Larkins's nervous tension around Emily, the maid's deliberate evasiveness, Mr. Thorne's polished precision, and even the Carraway's curious inquisitiveness, all were puzzle pieces. Individually they might mean nothing. Together they suggested motives, misdirections, and perhaps even concealed hostility. Miss Marple reached for her notebook, jotting down impressions in shorthand only she could decipher. She did not yet know the full story, nor did she wish to speculate aloud. A careful watch of human behavior, she reminded herself, often revealed what words could not. She sensed that the truth behind Thomas's fall was hidden not in objects or evidence but in gestures, glances, and the unguarded moments when people let their masks slip. As evening approached, a soft breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of lilacs from the garden. Outside, the village resumed its quiet routines, though the underlying tension lingered. A subtle but unmistakable reminder that the previous day's event had disturbed more than one life. Miss Marple, however, felt no rush. Secrets she knew could not be forced. They revealed themselves in time, often when least expected, and she was determined to wait, watching, listening, and understanding until the proper moment arrived. By the next morning, the entire village of St. Mary Mead seemed to hum with speculation. Every conversation, from the post office to the church pews, included the incident of Thomas Larkin's fall. Rumours had begun to crystallize into theories, each more fanciful than the last. Yet beneath the clamour, Miss Marple moved quietly, observing, listening, and noting the subtleties that others so often overlooked. The local constable, a conscientious but easily flustered man named Sergeant Perkins, had arrived at the Wilkinson estate early, clipboard in hand. He had already spoken with Lady Wilkinson, Mrs. Larkins, Mr. Thorne, and several other guests, and he seemed eager to close the matter quickly. "We have our preliminary statements," he announced to anyone within earshot, "and everything points to an unfortunate accident." He spoke with a firmness that suggested satisfaction with this convenient conclusion, though Miss Marple could detect the faint tremor of doubt beneath his words. Immediately, attention turned to Mr. Harold Thorne, the solicitor who had been in conversation with Thomas just prior to the incident. Several guests, quick to supply their own interpretations, hinted that Mr. Thorne had motive and opportunity. "It must have been him," Mrs. Pritchard whispered to a neighbour, her eyes darting toward him. "He always has that cold, calculating look. One could almost imagine him pushing Thomas in a moment of irritation." Miss Marple, observing from her usual perch on a low chair in the drawing-room, allowed herself a small sigh. It was almost inevitable that someone outwardly calm and composed would be suspected first. Human nature, she reflected, often blamed those who seemed most controlled, assuming that coolness concealed malice. Yet experience had taught her that appearances could be misleading. Mr. Thorne, for his part, appeared thoroughly affronted by the insinuations. "I assure you," he said, his tone polite but firm, "I had no cause to wish young Mr. Larkin's harm. I was merely offering guidance on the arrangements for the garden party. That this misfortune occurred during our conversation is, I assure you, entirely coincidental." He gestured toward the spot in the garden where the scuff of yesterday's event was still faintly visible. His precision in words and gestures was almost theatrical, and Miss Marple noted it with quiet interest. Meanwhile, Mrs. Larkins, though still shaken, seemed eager to absolve Mr. Thorne of blame. Her own eyes, however, betrayed a different story. She glanced repeatedly toward Emily Hargrove, her expression a mix of worry and quiet accusation. I just hope no one thinks anyone did this on purpose," she murmured to Miss Marple when they were briefly alone. The older detective listened carefully, noting the subtle stress in Mrs. Larkins's voice and the barely perceptible tension in her hands. Emily herself had been summoned to the drawing-room by Lady Wilkinson, who insisted on learning what the maid knew. Emily recounted her version of the events, emphasizing that she had been in the kitchen and had seen nothing beyond Thomas's brief argument with Mr. Thorne. Her voice was steady, yet her hands, clasped tightly in front of her, betrayed her nervousness. Miss Marple observed the same flickers of anxiety she had noticed the previous day, and her mind quietly catalogued them alongside every other small detail. The young Carraways, eager to participate in the discussion, added their own theories. Perhaps someone was jealous of Thomas, Miss Lillian suggested, her eyes wide. Or maybe he stumbled while avoiding a prank. Her brother David nodded, pointing to the hedges where he believed a garden tool might have caused a misstep. Though both were well-intentioned, their observations were cursory, lacking the depth of understanding Miss Marple had honed over decades. Yet she encouraged their input, knowing that even the most trivial comment could contain an overlooked clue. Reverend Peabody, summoned by Lady Wilkinson to mediate, attempted to maintain a calm atmosphere. "We must not allow ourselves to be carried away by speculation," he said gently. "Thomas's condition is serious enough, without the added burden of unfounded accusations. Let us wait for the doctor's further assessment." He spoke with measured concern, though his brief hesitation when mentioning Mr. Thorne did not escape Miss Marple's notice. Sergeant Perkins, growing impatient with the villagers' discussions, had begun methodically recording statements. "We'll need to consider anyone who had motive or opportunity," he declared. "For now, Mr. Thorne is the obvious person to question further." If there's more to this, it will become apparent soon. The constable's eagerness to pursue the obvious line of inquiry reflected the common human desire to resolve uncertainty quickly, even at the expense of thorough investigation. Miss Marple, however, remained outwardly detached. She had learned long ago that the most apparent suspect was rarely the true one. Observing human behavior required patience, attention to nuance, and the ability to see beneath the surface. She noted the small contradictions in the villagers' statements. Mrs. Larkin's partiality, Emily's nervous hesitations, Mr. Thorne's overly polished demeanor, and the Carraways' naive interpretations. Each detail, while insufficient alone, formed threads in a complex web. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple excused herself to stroll through the garden once more. The rosebeds glimmered with dew, and the sunlight danced on the rippling surface of the pond, creating a serene contrast to the tension that had settled over the household. She observed the scuff marks, the slightly disturbed soil, and the angles of the pergola shadows, all minor details unnoticed by the villagers, but meaningful in her careful mind. By the end of the day, the village had begun to coalesce around the theory of Mr. Thorne's involvement. His calmness, his presence near the scene, and his proximity to Thomas during their conversation made him the obvious suspect. Yet Miss Marple, seated quietly in her chair with a cup of tea, remained unconvinced. She had observed more than anyone else, and the inconsistencies, the flicker of Emily's gaze, the subtle avoidance of Mrs. Larkins, the Carraways' misplaced observations, suggested that the truth lay elsewhere, hidden beneath layers of distraction and polite deception. Miss Marple, ever patient, knew that time would reveal what hasty accusations could not. She would watch, listen, and wait, and when the proper moment came, the true story of Thomas Larkins's fall would be revealed, not by appearances, but by the quiet, telling truths that only she could perceive. It was mid-morning when Miss Marple returned to the Wilkinson estate, ostensibly to inquire after Thomas Larkins. Yet her real purpose was far subtler, to observe, to notice, and to allow the smallest, seemingly inconsequential details to reveal what others could not perceive. She had already seen the obvious, the tension between Mrs. Larkins and her maid, the villagers' eagerness to blame Mr. Thorne, the nervousness of the young Carraways. But Miss Marple knew that the truth of human mischief was rarely found in the loudest theories. It hid in quiet corners, in overlooked gestures, and in fleeting glances. The drawing room, usually so ordered, betrayed signs of hurried activity. A teacup had been left slightly askew on the silver tray, a chair angled unusually toward the window. Miss Marple's eyes swept over the details calmly, noting the subtle disturbances in the otherwise pristine household. These small disarrangements often indicated more than mere oversight. They revealed the presence of tension, distraction, or concealed movement. Her attention then turned to Emily Hargrove, who was dusting the shelves near the fireplace. The young maid's hands shook slightly as she arranged the ornaments, and she avoided direct eye contact. Miss Marple approached slowly, speaking gently. "Emily, might I trouble you to show me where Thomas was found in the garden?" The maid nodded, leading her along the stone path that curved around the rosebeds and toward the spot where the boy had fallen. "He was near the pergola," Emily said softly, "just there by the hedge. I didn't see exactly what happened. I only heard a shout and ran out." Her voice, though quiet, carried a subtle hesitation. Miss Marple made a mental note. Hesitation could indicate fear, uncertainty, or perhaps concealment. As they reached the pergola, Miss Marple's gaze settled on the edge of the flower bed. The soil was disturbed, of course, but it was not the usual kind of disarray from a simple stumble. She crouched slightly, running her gloved fingers lightly over the ground. There a faint indentation, almost imperceptible, as if someone's hand or small object had brushed the edge of the rosebed. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. A child might stumble and fall, yes, but such an impression suggested a hand, deliberate or accidental, had interfered with Thomas's path. Emily, standing close by, seemed unaware of the subtle marking. Yet Miss Marple could not ignore the way the maid's foot tapped nervously against the paving stone. The gesture was small, almost unconscious, yet it held a weight that only careful observation could reveal. "Did anyone else approach this area yesterday?" Miss Marple inquired casually. Emily shook her head. No one else was near here, at least that I saw. Just Thomas and Mr. Thorne talking. and then the others appeared after the shout. Her eyes flicked to Miss Marple, and the older woman detected the faintest trace of guilt, or perhaps apprehension. It was impossible to say which, and that very ambiguity made the clue all the more significant. Miss Marple stood brushing off her gloves. She allowed her gaze to drift around the garden, pretending to admire the blooms while her mind worked quietly. The scuffed earth, the subtle indentation, the nervous maid, these were threads that had yet to be woven into a coherent picture. She would not press Emily, not yet. People often revealed their own secrets in due time, especially when they felt secure in the knowledge that no one else had noticed. The solicitor, Mr. Thorne, appeared at the edge of the garden, adjusting his waistcoat as he approached. "Miss Marple, I hope you are not making a habit of wandering the grounds unattended," he said, his voice tinged with the faintest strain of irritation. "It could be dangerous, particularly with Thomas unwell." Miss Marple inclined her head politely. "I assure you I am careful," she replied softly, her eyes briefly meeting his. There was a tension there she could not ignore, a polish too precise to be natural, though whether it was anxiety, propriety, or something more subtle, she could not yet determine. Mr. Thorne, for all his outward calm, seemed aware that someone was observing more than the obvious, a fact that would serve her later. As Mr. Thorne walked away, Miss Marple turned her attention back to the garden. Her eyes caught a shimmer near the base of the pergola, a tiny fragment of torn fabric, almost invisible against the paving stones. It was pale, delicate, and faintly frayed at the edge. Miss Marple stooped to examine it, noting that it did not match the fabric of Thomas's clothing, nor did it belong to any of the older ladies' ensembles. It was small, almost insignificant, but such minutiae often concealed the most telling secrets. Miss Marple sat quietly on a nearby bench, letting her thoughts settle like sediment in a jar. The fragment of fabric, the indentation in the soil, Emily's hesitation, they were pieces of a puzzle that no one else had begun to assemble. Hasty accusations toward Mr. Thorne were premature, and while the villagers focused on the most conspicuous figure, the truth lingered in the unnoticed corners of the garden and in the small gestures that only a careful observer could detect. By afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her own home, carrying the fragment of fabric wrapped carefully in tissue paper. She placed it on her desk beside her notebook, reviewing her observations from the past 2 days. The web of human behavior, motivations, and concealed movements was intricate, but she felt the beginnings of clarity forming. Each small detail, trivial though it might seem to the casual observer, held significance in the pattern that only she could discern. Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, sipping her tea, and allowed herself a quiet smile. Patience, she reminded herself, was the key. The villagers were quick to jump to conclusions, eager to find a culprit in the obvious place. Yet the real truth, she knew, always waited, hidden in plain sight in the gestures, omissions, and overlooked minutiae that revealed the motives of human hearts. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the Wilkinson garden, the story of Thomas Larkin's fall was beginning to reveal itself, one small, hidden clue at a time. By the following morning, the tranquility of St. Mary Mead was further disrupted, not by gossip alone, but by the subtle revelations that began to surface among the villagers. In the cozy drawing rooms, behind neatly trimmed hedges and along the village lanes, whispers of hidden tensions wove themselves into the fabric of polite conversation. Miss Marple, ever attentive, followed the threads without drawing notice, observing both words and silences with her customary precision. Lady Wilkinson, though courteous, had spent much of the morning conferring quietly with her housekeeper and the ever-dutiful Emily. It was in these hushed moments that Miss Marple noted the faintest traces of unease. Lady Wilkinson's well-practiced composure faltered occasionally in the presence of Emily, whose own demeanour was taut with an odd mixture of apprehension and self-consciousness. Miss Marple's mind catalogued these observations. There was more here than met the eye, far more than an accident or a casual fall could explain. It was during a brief visit to Mrs. Larkins's home that Miss Marple first encountered the underlying fractures in her household. Mrs. Larkins, who had been outwardly attentive to her nephew Thomas, now revealed glimpses of long-buried resentments. She spoke nervously of her sister-in-law, murmuring that Thomas often acted the way he pleased and paid little heed to guidance. Yet in her pauses, in the subtle way she avoided Emily's gaze, Miss Marple detected another story, one of fear, caution, and perhaps blame she could not articulate aloud. Emily herself, when summoned to serve tea, revealed through small gestures that she was both observant and guarded. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured, and she lingered a moment longer than necessary when placing the cup before Miss Marple. That pause, though minute, conveyed a tension she had yet to resolve. Miss Marple's experience told her that the maid's unease was not mere timidity. It suggested knowledge, or at least suspicion, of something that others preferred to keep hidden. Across the village, the Carraways' curiosity continued to drive them into private corners, seeking information from those willing or unwilling to talk. Miss Marple observed them at a distance, noting how Lillian's questions were pointed but naive, often revealing more to the listener than to the questioner. David's eagerness, while seemingly helpful, risked disturbing fragile alliances. Yet these minor intrusions proved valuable. Villagers' reactions to the young pair often illuminated relationships they themselves had not fully acknowledged. It was in the course of these observations that Miss Marple began connecting certain subtle inconsistencies. Mrs. Larkins's selective concern, Emily's anxious glances, Mr. Thorne's overly composed demeanor, they all hinted at intersecting motives and hidden histories. Human nature, she reminded herself, rarely existed in isolation. Grievances compounded, secrets intertwined, and small slights accumulated until they erupted in unexpected ways. Miss Marple then turned her attention to Mr. Harold Thorne. She visited his modest office under the pretense of discussing minor legal matters, observing the precision of his arrangements and the meticulous order of his papers. Yet even in this apparent rigidity, she found contradictions. A letter torn in haste, a faint smudge on a ledger, and the briefest hesitation when he recounted his movements during the previous day. Each of these details, insignificant in isolation, suggested a man accustomed to control, but momentarily unsettled by circumstances beyond his immediate influence. Reverend Peabody, too, revealed unexpected layers. During their encounter in the parish garden, he spoke warmly of Thomas's character. Yet Miss Marple noted the faint shadow of worry that passed across his features when mentioning certain neighbours. It was as though he had knowledge he could not articulate, a tension between truth and propriety that made even his gentle manner more complex than it appeared. As Miss Marple walked through the village that afternoon, the network of human connections grew increasingly apparent. Long-buried disputes, minor jealousies, and past slights, once insignificant in the orderly lives of St. Mary Mead, now appeared to converge around a single, perplexing incident. She began to see patterns, Emily's nervous attentions, Mrs. Larkin's avoidance, the Carraways' probing curiosity, and the subtle but calculated movements of Mr. Thorne. Together, these threads hinted at a story far richer and more entangled than the village gossip suggested. It was not only what the villagers said that mattered, but also what they did not say. Miss Marple noted the conversations cut short, the sudden diversions of attention, and the carefully concealed glances. Every hesitation carried meaning. Every deflection held weight. Even the flowers in the garden, so meticulously arranged, bore traces of hurried touches, suggesting someone had moved quickly or stumbled before Thomas fell. These minor details, so easily overlooked by others, formed a latticework of insight in Miss Marple's mind. By evening, Miss Marple returned to her home, notebook in hand. She reflected on the day's encounters, reviewing the myriad subtleties she had observed. Secrets, she realized, were never wholly hidden. They manifested in gestures, glances, and inconsistencies. The villagers' fears, anxieties, and hidden motives were threads that, when carefully examined, could reveal the pattern behind Thomas's fall. Sitting by the window with a cup of tea, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet, knowing smile. The puzzle was becoming clearer. Each character, each subtle tension, each carefully masked emotion, these were all pieces that would, in time, form a complete picture. And the truth, though concealed for now beneath layers of social propriety and polite misdirection, was steadily making itself known to one who knew how to observe, listen, and interpret the most delicate signs of human nature. In St. Mary Mead, Outward appearances suggested that life continued as usual. The gardens bloomed, the lanes remained orderly, and the village seemed untouched. Yet beneath this calm, the invisible currents of resentment, fear, and secrecy were stirring, and Miss Marple, ever patient, was prepared to follow them wherever they led. Late in the afternoon, just as the sun cast long golden shadows across the village green, a commotion drew the attention of St. Mary Mead. A message had arrived by post, carried by the young Mr. Carraway, who looked uncharacteristically flustered. The note was addressed to Lady Wilkinson, and bore the hurried angular script of someone unfamiliar with formal correspondence. She unfolded it carefully, her expression shifting from polite interest to disquiet as her eyes scanned the contents. Miss Marple, seated nearby, observed the change in Lady Wilkinson with quiet attention. "What news, Agatha?" she asked gently. Lady Wilkinson shook her head slightly, lips pressed together. "It is from the Wilkinson branch in Somerset. Apparently a valuable heirloom, a small diamond brooch that has been in the family for generations, has gone missing. It was last seen in the presence of Thomas Larkins." Her hands trembled faintly as she placed the note on the table. "The timing. It seems too coincidental." The room, already tense from Thomas's fall, grew even more charged. Mrs. Larkins' face paled, and Emily, who had been pouring tea, froze mid-motion. Even Mr. Thorne's expression betrayed a flicker of concern before he masked it with his habitual composure. Miss Marple, however, allowed only the faintest raising of her eyebrows. Patterns, she reflected, often emerged in the smallest of coincidences. The apparent misfortune of Thomas Larkins now intersected with a long-buried opportunity, the missing heirloom. As the villagers gathered to discuss this unexpected revelation, theories multiplied like sparks. Mrs. Pritchard, as ever eager to speak first, leaned close to Mrs. Larkins. "See? I told you there was more to this than clumsiness. Perhaps it was no accident after all." She spoke as if pronouncing a final judgment, oblivious to the subtle reactions of those around her. Emily's hand tightened on the tea tray, and Miss Marple's keen eye noted the slight tremor. The maid's composure, already fragile, now seemed strained under the weight of unspoken knowledge. Miss Marple made a mental note of it, considering how fear of discovery might influence behavior. Often the guilty, or those who knew more than they should, revealed themselves through small, almost imperceptible gestures. Meanwhile, Mr. Thorne, who had previously seemed the most likely suspect for the fall itself, now adopted a different posture. He moved deliberately, ensuring that no one could detect the subtle adjustment of his cufflinks or the brief glance he cast toward the open window overlooking the garden. Miss Marple, watching him unobtrusively, noted these little shifts. A man who controls appearances as meticulously as Mr. Thorne did rarely acted without reason, and any disruption in that control could betray an inner concern. Reverend Peabody, summoned to mediate the conversation, spoke gently but firmly. "We must not jump to conclusions. A missing heirloom is serious, yes, but the circumstances remain unclear. There is no evidence linking Thomas or anyone here to its disappearance." He glanced briefly at Emily, who lowered her gaze, fingers curling slightly around the tray's edge. Miss Marple, ever attentive, caught the faintest flicker of unease that passed across the maid's face. The young Carraways, still brimming with curiosity, whispered to one another about the possibility of theft. "Could someone have taken it while Thomas was in the garden?" Lillian asked, her voice barely audible. David nodded earnestly. Their questions, though innocent, provided Miss Marple with a wealth of behavioral insight. The way villagers responded to even small probes often revealed hidden allegiances, resentments, or fears. It was during the ensuing discussion that Miss Marple noticed a subtle irregularity in the table setting. A silver napkin ring had been shifted slightly, its position inconsistent with its placement the previous day. A trivial detail, perhaps, but one that suggested hurried movement. Miss Marple's mind began connecting threads. The scuff marks in the garden, Emily's nervous tension, the maid's careful avoidance of certain topics, and now this minor disruption within the house. Their pattern was emerging, faint yet persistent, hinting at deliberate action rather than mere accident. Just then, a faint noise from the servants' quarters drew attention. Emily had returned to her duties, but the shuffling of papers and the soft murmur of voices betrayed someone else's presence. Miss Marple, with a gentle clearing of her throat, prompted Emily to glance in her direction. The maid's eyes flickered, betraying surprise, and then quickly lowered again. It was a small act, almost imperceptible, yet Miss Marple recognized it for what it was, a fleeting acknowledgement that all was not as it seemed. Lady Wilkinson, sensing the growing tension, attempted to restore calm. "Please, everyone, let us not succumb to suspicion. We must remain composed." But the air had already changed. The villagers, once confident in their judgments, now faced uncertainty. The new revelation, the missing heirloom, had shifted suspicion, redirecting attention and unsettling the assumptions that had seemed so secure just hours earlier. Miss Marple, quietly observing each reaction, allowed herself a faint smile. The puzzle was becoming more intricate, yes, but in complexity lay clarity. The connections, subtle though they were, revealed motives, concealed fears, and the faintest traces of action previously overlooked. She understood that the true story would not emerge from hasty accusations or overt displays of suspicion. Rather, it would be revealed through observation, patience, and the careful interpretation of small telling details. By late afternoon, the village had settled into a wary silence. Conversations were measured, glances more deliberate, and movements cautious. Even the sunlight seemed tempered, casting long shadows across lawns and walkways, as though nature itself acknowledged the growing tension. Miss Marple remained calm, serene in her understanding that the truth, hidden beneath layers of misdirection, fear, and secrecy, was slowly making itself known. And in her mind, she began to trace the path from yesterday's fall to today's revelation, recognizing that the threads of human behavior were beginning to weave a story that only she could fully comprehend. By the following morning, the atmosphere in St. Mary Mead had grown tense. Though the villagers remained outwardly polite, conversations were careful, glances cautious, and every minor action seemed weighted with hidden meaning. Miss Marple, ever patient, understood that now was the time to observe rather than question directly. In the subtle exchanges, the tiny inconsistencies, and the quiet hesitations, the truth would reveal itself. She began her day with a casual visit to the Wilkinson estate, armed with a cup of tea and a small deliberate curiosity. Lady Wilkinson welcomed her with restrained warmth, though a faint crease in her brow suggested worry. "Jane, I trust you are well this morning," she said, guiding Miss Marple toward the garden. "We all feel the strain of these events, I'm afraid. One does hope for clarity soon." Miss Marple smiled gently, sipping her tea as she walked along the stone path. "Clarity," she said softly, "sometimes requires patience, and the most telling details often appear when no one expects them." She allowed her gaze to drift across the rosebeds, noting the subtle shifts in soil and the faint indentation she had observed days before. Small things often overlooked held the key. Her first deliberate test involved Emily Hargrove. Miss Marple engaged the young maid in a conversation about trivial matters, the weather, the bloom of the roses, even the arrangement of cutlery for the next tea service. All the while she subtly introduced references to the garden and Thomas's fall. Emily responded with polite, cautious replies, though her hands betrayed a faint tension, a subtle tremor that quickened whenever Miss Marple mentioned the pergola. It was a minor reaction, almost imperceptible to anyone else, but to the seasoned detective it was telling. Miss Marple's next test was more pointed, though still delivered with a light touch. She approached Mr. Thorne under the guise of discussing legal arrangements for the missing heirloom. "It is curious," she said, lifting her teacup slightly, "how things can disappear when one least expects it. Sometimes even the most careful hands overlook a small detail, only to regret it later." She observed him carefully as he spoke, noting the deliberate composure he maintained. Yet there was a brief, almost imperceptible pause when she mentioned the heirloom near the garden. A fleeting glance at the pergola followed, a reaction so quick that most would have missed it. Even Lady Wilkinson, whose composure seemed unshakable, exhibited subtle tells under Miss Marple's quiet scrutiny. When speaking of Thomas's fall, she hesitated for a fraction of a second before asserting the timeline of events. The pause was slight, but Miss Marple recognized it for what it might be, a momentary struggle to reconcile what was socially expected with what she knew, or perhaps feared to be true. Later, Miss Marple visited Mrs. Larkins, ostensibly to inquire after Thomas's condition. In casual conversation, she allowed her comments to touch upon loyalty, responsibility, and attention to household duties, all while observing micro-expressions, the flicker of a frown, the brief tightening of hands, and a subtle shift in stance whenever the topic of Emily or Thomas arose. Each tiny signal was a thread, and Miss Marple carefully catalogued them, knowing that the pattern they formed would eventually point clearly to the truth. The young Carraways, curious and eager, provided yet another lens. Miss Marple engaged them in light conversation about village events, subtly introducing questions about the garden, the fallen boy, and the missing heirloom. Lillian's eyes widened slightly, and David's eagerness made him fidget. They were innocent, of course, but their reactions revealed the underlying tension felt by everyone around them. Children, Miss Marple reflected, often sensed truths adults attempted to hide, and their unguarded responses could illuminate the behaviors of others. Throughout the day, Miss Marple employed a deliberate strategy of observation, interspersed with mild suggestion. She allowed her questions to be casual, even seemingly unrelated, while her careful attention captured every subtle shift in demeanor. A hesitation here, a diverted glance there, a slightly accelerated heartbeat. These were the indicators she sought. The solution, she knew, would not be found in accusations, but in watching how people responded when their private thoughts brushed against external prompts. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had pieced together a pattern. Emily's nervous responses in the garden, her fleeting hesitation when the pergola or the heirloom was mentioned, and her subtle gestures all pointed toward knowledge she had not yet revealed. Mr. Thorne's measured reactions were revealing too, but in a different way. They suggested awareness of propriety rather than culpability. Lady Wilkinson's brief inconsistencies hinted at concern for appearances rather than action. Each subtle behavior, when carefully combined, illuminated a hierarchy of awareness and involvement. Miss Marple sat quietly in the drawing room as the evening descended, allowing the village to go about its routines. She reflected on the day's careful tests. People's true natures, she knew, were often disclosed not through words but through the smallest, almost unconscious actions. Patience, observation, and gentle provocation were the keys to unlocking the story. The truth had not yet been spoken aloud, but it had revealed itself to her through a series of delicate, telling signs. And in that quiet understanding, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. She had tested the waters, observed the ripples, and catalogued the tremors of human emotion and behavior. When the proper moment arrived, the intricate web of truth would be laid bare, not by hasty accusation, but by careful, deliberate revelation. That evening, the Wilkinson estate was quieter than usual. Shadows stretched across the polished floors and garden paths, and the familiar creak of the old house seemed sharper in the stillness. Miss Marple, seated near the drawing-room window, observed the subtle movements of the household, the measured footsteps of servants, the occasional whisper of conversation, the delicate adjustment of a vase or teacup. Each gesture, each glance spoke volumes to her trained eye. Emily Hargrove, the young maid, moved with attention that was now unmistakable. She lingered near the kitchen door, her hands busy with trivial tasks, but her gaze kept returning to the drawing room. Every so often she glanced toward the garden, as if replaying some unseen event in her mind. Miss Marple, quietly sipping her tea, noted the rhythmic tapping of her foot and the slight tremor in her hands, behaviors she had observed before, but now with greater clarity. The pattern was emerging. Emily's movements were those of someone carrying a concealed truth. Miss Marple allowed the conversation to drift innocently toward Thomas's fall and the missing heirloom. She spoke gently, almost casually, of the events in the garden. "It is curious," she remarked, "how small incidents sometimes have far-reaching consequences. One moment of carelessness or a fleeting distraction can change everything." Emily flinched at the remark, the tremor in her hands now pronounced. Her eyes darted briefly toward the pergola, and she bit her lower lip, a tell Miss Marple recognized as a sign of suppressed guilt. No one else noticed. To them she appeared merely flustered by the discussion. Miss Marple, however, understood that the smallest, unconscious reactions often revealed the largest truths. The conversation continued, drifting to other topics: the village fair, the approaching harvest, even the state of the roses. Yet Miss Marple allowed subtle cues to guide her questions, carefully steering toward the garden and the events surrounding Thomas's accident. Every casual remark was a test, every suggestion a way to provoke a reaction without forcing confession. Then, quietly, a breakthrough arrived. Emily, while retrieving a silver tray from the sideboard, accidentally dropped a small fragment of cloth. It fluttered to the floor, catching Miss Marple's eye immediately. She picked it up with delicate fingers, noting the pale, frayed edge. The fabric was unmistakable, the same material she had observed near the pergola days before. Miss Marple's lips curved into a slight, almost imperceptible smile. The revelation crystallized in her mind. The indentation in the soil, the subtle tremor in Emily's hands, the fragment of cloth, all pointed to one conclusion. The maid had been present at a crucial moment, and her nervousness was not mere timidity, but the result of concealed involvement. Miss Marple's keen understanding of human behavior allowed her to see what no one else had. The accident, the missing heirloom, and the fleeting moments in the garden were intertwined through Emily's actions. Miss Marple observed Emily carefully, noting how she moved, how she adjusted her apron, and how her eyes flicked toward the garden. Every subtle gesture reinforced the detective's growing certainty. There was no malice in Emily's demeanor, only fear and an almost desperate attempt to conceal what she had witnessed, and, inadvertently or not influenced, the room seemed to contract around Miss Marple's realization. Mr. Thorne, the focus of earlier suspicion, remained composed, unaware that the investigation had shifted quietly from him to someone less obvious. Lady Wilkinson, still anxious about the heirloom, spoke in measured tones, while Mrs. Larkins busied herself with the fireplace, unaware of the change in perceptive attention. Miss Marple, knowing the time was right, approached Emily with gentle calm. "My dear," she said softly, "would you mind telling me exactly what you saw in the garden that day?" Emily froze, her fingers gripping the edge of the tray. She looked down, eyes wide, then back toward Miss Marple, caught in the weight of the detective's quiet understanding. There was no need for force, no need for accusation. Miss Marple's calm presence, coupled with the accumulation of evidence drawn from Emily's own behaviors, compelled the maid to begin speaking. She recounted the moment Thomas slipped near the pergola, the way she had tried to intervene, and how in her nervousness she had inadvertently allowed the situation to worsen. She admitted to noticing the heirloom nearby, its small glint tempting, though she insisted she had not taken it. The stress of concealment, combined with fear of judgment, had created the tension Miss Marple had observed all along. Miss Marple listened quietly, nodding, her eyes never leaving Emily's face. Every gesture, every inflection, confirmed what her observations had already suggested. The incident had been accidental, but it had been compounded by human error and fear, emotions Miss Marple understood better than anyone. The missing heirloom, meanwhile, had been misplaced by Thomas himself, hidden in a small crevice during the scuffle and overlooked amid the chaos. The room remained silent as Emily finished speaking. The weight of unspoken anxiety lifted, leaving a sense of relief mingled with lingering embarrassment. Miss Marple, with characteristic gentleness, offered a reassuring smile. "Thank you, my dear. You were brave to speak the truth." Even the villagers, who had been ready to assign blame elsewhere, sensed the resolution. The clarity of events, revealed not through accusation, but through careful observation and subtle guidance, reshaped their understanding. The garden, the heirloom, and Thomas's accident were all linked, and the hidden truth had emerged, not through force or confrontation, but through patient attention to the small, telling signs that so often go unnoticed. Miss Marple, ever composed, allowed herself a quiet satisfaction. The threads were gathered, the puzzle completed, and in the serene glow of the drawing-room, the mystery, once tangled and complex, lay revealed in its entirety, a testament to the power of observation, patience, and insight into human nature. By the following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead had grown unusually quiet. Whispers circulated in muted tones, and even the most garrulous of villagers spoke with care. Miss Marple, however, moved with her usual calm, carrying a small parcel wrapped in tissue, the fragment of cloth she had found days before, a silent witness to events that had remained concealed. She had arranged for all those involved, to meet at the Wilkinson estate. Under the pretense of a casual morning gathering, allowing the setting to seem ordinary, while the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place, Lady Wilkinson received her guests with a composed smile. Though Miss Marple noted the subtle tension in her posture, even Mr. Thorne, ever precise in manner, appeared slightly preoccupied, glancing occasionally toward the garden and the drawing-room. Emily Hargrove, the young maid, fidgeted with the hem of her apron, eyes downcast and hands trembling ever so slightly. Miss Marple watched them all quietly, knowing that the truth would reveal itself in the most natural manner, without force or coercion. "Thank you all for joining me this morning," Miss Marple began, her tone light, almost conversational. "I thought it would be helpful for us to review the events of the past few days, particularly Thomas's unfortunate accident in the garden." Her eyes rested momentarily on each person in turn, calm yet piercing. Drawing subtle attention to details only she had observed, she paused, then continued. At first glance, it seemed obvious that the accident might have been caused by a slip, a misstep, or perhaps carelessness. And yet, as we all know, appearances are not always as they seem. Small details often tell a far richer story than loud accusations. Miss Marple picked up the fragment of cloth and held it delicately. "Consider this, found near the pergola where Thomas fell. On its own, it might seem unimportant, a mere scrap, but combined with other signs, disturbed soil, hurried footsteps, nervous gestures, it begins to tell a story of human hesitation, fear and unintended consequences." The room remained silent, all eyes turning toward the small piece of fabric. Miss Marple allowed the silence to linger, giving her words weight and letting the villagers' imaginations fill in the gaps. Then, with her characteristic subtlety, she shifted her attention. "And here we must consider the role of those who were present, those who moved through the garden that day, and how their actions, small as they may seem, intersected to create a situation that caused alarm and confusion." Emily, shifting uncomfortably, looked down at the floor, hands clasped tightly in front of her. Miss Marple spoke to her softly yet clearly, in a tone that left no room for misinterpretation. "Emily, it is unnecessary to feel fear. You acted in the moment, guided by instinct and care, but you also created conditions, though unintentional, that contributed to the accident." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she nodded, murmuring, I tried to stop him from falling, Miss Marple. I didn't mean... Her voice trailed off. Miss Marple inclined her head, giving the maid a gentle smile. "I know, my dear, and that is why it is essential to consider human nature, not just appearances. Your nervousness, the fragment of cloth you dropped, the hesitation when certain questions arose, all these were subtle signals of your involvement. They did not mark you as malicious, but as human, aware, caring, yet fearful. Turning now to the rest of the assembly," Miss Marple continued, "and as for the heirloom, the diamond brooch, it was not taken by anyone intending harm. Thomas himself, in the confusion, misplaced it near the base of the pergola, where it remained unnoticed until the unfolding of events drew our attention. The brooch's disappearance, like many things in life, was a simple misunderstanding compounded by fear and secrecy." Mr. Thorne, Lady Wilkinson and the others listened intently, absorbing the gentle yet firm clarity of her explanation. No accusations were made, no harsh words were spoken. Yet the puzzle, which had seemed so tangled and impenetrable, now rested fully in their understanding. Miss Marple allowed a moment of quiet to pass, watching faces soften and tension ease. "You see," she added, "the events of the past days were never the result of malice. Rather, they were a series of minor missteps, human reactions to unexpected situations, and the natural tendency to conceal what one fears may be misunderstood. In observing carefully, noting subtle behaviors, and understanding the hearts of those involved, one can perceive the truth even when it is hidden beneath layers of hesitation and propriety." Emily, now composed but still trembling slightly, met Miss Marple's eyes. "I am sorry," she whispered. Miss Marple's reply was gentle, patient, and filled with the warmth that always softened her insights. "There is no need for apologies. What matters is that we understand the truth, learn from it, and proceed with care. Human beings are fallible, and life in a village such as ours is full of small errors, minor confusions and unspoken fears. It is our awareness and compassion that guide us through them. The villagers, absorbing the full picture, nodded in silent agreement. There were smiles now, tentative but genuine, as relief replaced suspicion. The mystery, so carefully concealed and tangled in layers of human behavior, had been untangled not through accusation or confrontation, but through patient observation and gentle guidance. Miss Marple, observing the softening faces around her, allowed herself a faint smile. The truth had emerged quietly, naturally, as it always does when human nature is carefully studied. She had guided the revelation, allowing the small signs, the fabric, the gestures, the hesitations, to speak for themselves. And in doing so, she had reminded everyone present that understanding, patience, and attentiveness often reveal more than suspicion or haste ever could. As the villagers dispersed, the room settling into its familiar calm, Miss Marple reflected quietly on the day's events. Human nature, she thought, was a tapestry of small actions, subtle signals, and delicate truths. To see clearly, one must observe patiently, consider kindly, and listen carefully, not only to words but to the unspoken language of behavior. And in that quiet reflection, she knew that St. Mary Mead had returned to its gentle rhythms, richer in understanding and tempered by the insight that even the smallest of actions could cast long shadows. By the next morning, the village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a calm that felt both familiar and newly cautious. The events of the past week, the fall of Thomas Larkins, the mystery of the missing heirloom, and the quiet revelation of hidden truths had left their mark, though life continued its gentle rhythms. Children ran along the lanes, their laughter echoing past neatly trimmed hedges. Shopkeepers arranged their displays with precision, exchanging polite greetings, while the distant church bells rang a reminder of continuity and constancy. Miss Marple, however, walked with the serene composure that had always marked her presence. She paused at the corner of the village green, observing a few early risers tending their gardens, exchanging nods and sharing brief words. The atmosphere was outwardly peaceful, yet, as always, the detective noted subtle traces of lingering unease. A glance held too long, a frown quickly masked, a slight hesitation in speech. Beneath the surface, the recent events had left impressions, small but enduring. Lady Wilkinson emerged from her home, her expression calm, though with the faint shadow of worry that Miss Marple had come to recognize. "Jane," she called gently, "thank you for your guidance. Without your insight, I fear the tension might have persisted far longer than necessary." Miss Marple inclined her head, smiling softly. "It is always a pleasure to help, Lady Wilkinson. The truth once discovered has a way of easing hearts, and in St. Mary Mead, understanding even of the most delicate nature carries the greatest value." Emily Hargrove, the young maid, had resumed her duties with a quiet diligence. Miss Marple observed her briefly, noting a subtle shift in posture, a lightness in step, and the absence of the tremor that had marked her movements during the past days. There was relief in her composure, and perhaps a newfound confidence born of honesty and acknowledgement. Miss Marple's heart warmed at the sight. The maid had endured fear and secrecy, yet emerged with dignity and tact. Even Mr. Thorne, who had remained a model of restraint throughout the investigation, allowed a faint smile to cross his features. His meticulous nature, once the source of suspicion, now seemed a source of reassurance. The villagers, freed from uncertainty, began to engage in conversations more openly, though always with the refined caution that small communities cultivate after incidents that disturb their routines. Miss Marple strolled past the garden where Thomas had fallen, now bathed in the gentle glow of morning sunlight. The pergola stood serene, the flowers neatly arranged, and the ground undisturbed except for the natural impressions of daily care. It was a quiet testament to both recovery and the subtle lessons imparted by human experience. In her mind, Miss Marple replayed the past days, cataloguing the behaviors, gestures, and minute details that had revealed the truth. The pattern, so intricate yet logical, had unfolded naturally for one willing to observe patiently and without prejudice. Throughout the village, conversations hinted at lingering curiosity, though the mood had shifted from suspicion to reflection. Mrs. Larkins, once tense and guarded, now spoke with a gentle caution, sharing stories of Thomas's early childhood while observing Emily with a mixture of relief and renewed trust. The young Carraways, always eager for adventure, engaged in polite chatter, their curiosity tempered by understanding that some mysteries were best revealed with patience and careful observation. Miss Marple, seated in her favourite chair by the window, allowed herself a quiet moment of contemplation. Human nature, she reflected, was never entirely predictable, yet patterns emerged in small actions, subtle expressions, and fleeting gestures. The fall, the missing heirloom, and the nervous reactions of those involved had all been part of a complex tapestry. By paying attention, by listening, and by observing without judgment, the truth had been gently uncovered. The detective's gaze drifted to the distant church steeple, bathed in sunlight. Life, she mused, continued in its quiet rhythm, and yet the events that had passed would leave subtle imprints on hearts and minds. Villagers would remember the lesson, that appearances are often deceiving, that fear and secrecy can cloud understanding, and that gentle guidance paired with careful observation can resolve even the most tangled of mysteries. In the afternoon, Miss Marple visited the garden again, where Thomas, recovering from his fall, played quietly with a small wooden toy. Emily tended to him with careful attention, no longer burdened by fear, and the scene held a sense of normalcy restored. Miss Marple watched from a distance, noting the subtle smiles exchanged between caretaker and child, and the understated relief of Lady Wilkinson, who now felt certain that all was well. The quiet village path soon filled with the sound of life resuming, footsteps along the lanes, the soft chatter of neighbours, and the distant call of a blackbird perched upon a fence post. Miss Marple moved through the scene with serene attentiveness, her mind cataloguing lessons learned and the delicate balance of human behaviour she had observed. In every glance, gesture, and whispered conversation, she found evidence of resilience, honesty, and the enduring value of gentle guidance. As evening approached, the village lights glimmered softly, casting long shadows that danced across the cobblestones. Miss Marple, reflecting on the week's events, understood that the resolution of the mystery had not only restored order, but also revealed the subtleties of human character. In St. Mary Mead, life had returned to its gentle rhythm, tempered by the quiet knowledge that even the smallest actions can leave lasting impressions. Sitting back in her chair, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, satisfied smile. She had observed, listened, and understood. The truth had emerged quietly, naturally, and without spectacle. And in that calm, reflective moment, she knew that the village, for all its small fears and hidden tensions, was once again at peace, its people wiser for the gentle lessons of patience, attentiveness, and the enduring power of understanding human nature.